So one of the things that distinguishes the early Cold War from the aftermath of World War II from the aftermath of World War One is that U.S. involvement in international affairs is much more global rather than focused on Europe. And maybe the best example of this comes in Korea. So Korea had been previously had been kind of a Chinese vassal state, which Japan invades in the late 19th century and will colonize. And so it remains a Japanese colony throughout basically the first half of the 20th century. And then after the World War II, the question is what to do with it. And Korea was addressed at Yalta, the Yalta Conference, the diplomatic conference that ends last meeting between FDR, Churchill, and Stalin in the winter of 1945. And the agreement is that Korea will be divided into two halves, a Northern Korea, a Southern Korea. The Soviets will have a predominant influence over Northern Korea, the Americans over Southern Korea, and the two sides eventually will be reunified through an all-Korean election. Northern Korea, the leader is Kim Il Sung, who the man here on the left, who is a fanatic communist. I mean, someone who makes Stalin look like a liberal Democrat, and who speaks a lot about liberating the southern portion of Korea. And then the leader of Southern Korea, largely installed by the Americans, is this man Syngman Rhee, autocratic, right winger who speaks a lot about liberating the northern section of the peninsula. And Rhee is an odd figure in that he had spent most of the interwar period in New Jersey in various religious retreats. The problem for the Americans is that most of the non-communist sort of political elite within South Korea had in one way or another collaborated with the Japanese, so they were clearly unsuitable to be new leaders of the country. And Rhee's advantage was that he was fanatically anti-communist. He was very loyal to the United States, and he hadn't been in Korea during the period of Japanese rule, so he was not in any way tainted by the Japanese. But this is a really unstable part of the world. I mean, the North Koreans are threatening the South Koreans. The South Koreans are threatening the North Koreans. Rhee is making no movement towards democracy, and Kim Il Sung is setting up what will eventually become the world's most draconian totalitarian dictatorship. And there's this sense among American leaders that they're just, they're tired of dealing with Rhee, who is a really difficult person to deal with, and they're also worried that maybe Rhee might, launch a war by invading the North. And so in January of 1950, Dean Acheson, who is Truman's new Secretary of State, he takes over when Truman is elected to a full term in 1948, delivers a speech. And Acheson, this is a photograph of him delivering the speech. Acheson is, why did that happen? Acheson is not a pacifist, to put it mildly. I mean, he's a quite hawkish approach towards the Cold War, but nonetheless, his concern is that he wants U.S. involvement in areas that are strategically vital. So in this speech, he talks about U.S. interests in East Asia, and he identifies the Japanese, and he identifies the newly independent country of Indonesia, and portions of Southeast Asia and the Philippines as inside what he calls the U.S. defense perimeter. But he deliberately does not include South Korea or Taiwan. The nationalists had lost the Chinese Civil War, but they had basically decamped to Taiwan, and Taiwan will become a nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek's regime. So this speech is perceived after the Korean War begins as Acheson giving a green light to the North Korean invasion of South Korea. This is not at all what he was doing. Basically, he by telling Rhee's government that, look, you can't count on U.S. support, he was trying to deter Rhee from invading the North, but it winds up having this effect. So in any case, in June of 1950, North Korea launches a surprise invasion of the South. Rhee's government is expected exposed as weak and ineffectual, and eventually the North Koreans press, and the South Korean forces are left isolated on this far southern southeastern tip of the peninsula. Rhee appeals for international support to save his regime. It turns out that at the time he's making this appeal, the Soviet Union is boycotting the UN Security Council to protest the decision by the Security Council that it will continue to seat the nationalist government of Taiwan as the Chinese representative to the Security Council, rather than the new communist government of mainland China. But because the Soviets are absent, they can't veto the resolution, and the resolution proclaims a UN Security Council military rescue of Rhee's government in South Korea, and they announced that the Americans will take the predominant role in this, and that the American general Douglas MacArthur will be the commanding general of the UN force. MacArthur had been the liberator of the Philippines in World War II. He was perceived as the most knowledgeable military figure in the East Asian sphere. His actual knowledge, I think, was substantially less than what it was presented as, but it was a very good propaganda effort. So these are a couple of photographs of him. MacArthur chooses this very risky but brilliant strategy of landing American forces at Incheon. So this is behind. Remember, the North Koreans have basically conquered all of this area, but he lands the bulk of the troops there, and his goal is to isolate the North Korean troops that are operating down here in the southern portion of Korea from North Korean supply lines. And there's a surprise element to this attack. It succeeds very well. The U.S. is militarily superior to North Korea. They're joined in fighting by South Korea by the Turks, intriguingly, and to a certain extent by the Australians and the British. But this is basically an American South Korean effort. The UN Security Council had authorized the preservation of South Korea up to the 38th parallel, which had been the dividing line between the two after World War II. But MacArthur announces that he's going to go further, and he's basically decided he's going to liberate all of Korea. He claims a deep knowledge of what he constantly refers to as the Oriental mind. In fact, MacArthur seems to know nothing of what's going on. The Chinese basically say they're not going to intervene in Korea to protect to bail out the North Korean invasions, but they're very, very clear, and they make this in as many ways as they possibly can through back channels to the United States. They say, look, if American troops come close to our borders, we're going to interpret this as a hostile act. We're going to intervene. Truman expresses some concern about this. MacArthur says, don't worry about it. The UN expresses some concern as well. And MacArthur basically plays the two sides off against each other. So when Truman sort of pressures him to do something and say, I can't take orders from you. I'm the commanding general of the UN security force. Only the UN people can give me orders. And then when the UN people give him orders, he says, look, I'm a US general. Only the commander in chief can give me orders. So the net result of this is that this invasion is largely initiated by MacArthur, absent any kind of political oversight, either from the United States or from the UN. And while it succeeds on paper, it ultimately brings the Chinese into the war. And what seemed like a very quick victory for the United States and its allies settles into a stalemate that lasts a couple of years. MacArthur pushes for the use of nuclear weapons against China. Truman says no. Then MacArthur leaks his demand to Republicans in Congress, and Truman ultimately fires MacArthur correctly for insubordination. And the war itself will end in a stalemate not until 1953. Now, the Korean War has two, I think, significant effects. The first is that it leads to a dramatic expansion of U.S. military spending and the U.S. military presence as a whole. It's an implementation of a document called NSC 68, which was National Security Review, which basically says that communism anywhere is a threat to the United States. So you can see the dramatic shoot up of the U.S. Defense budget, and it comes in a little in 52, a little in 53 as well, but it's not going to get down back to the 1950 level ever. And similarly, dramatic expansions of personnel in the U.S. Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force. So this is the first effect of Korea. It boosts U.S. defense spending. The second is that it really does draw the U.S. into East Asian affairs as a whole. This is sometimes called the Great Crescent theory. That is, that the U.S. basically decides that now that it's fighting in Korea, it's going to see this region as kind of a crescent, beginning in Japan, continuing through Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines, and then arcing back over into Southeast Asia, and is going to commit itself to the defense of the entirety of this Great Crescent, and hope to contain China in the same way that the U.S. is theoretically containing the Soviet Union. This is a contemporaneous map from 1951. It gives a sense. You can see the language here. The Chinese Reds. This is how they talked about the communists. Indonesia is the key to Southeast Asia if the Reds take over. But this is how the region is sold to the American public. That it's a vital aspect of U.S. national security interest to ensure that that these non-communist countries in East Asia do not fall to the Chinese. So a boost in military spending and a dramatic increase in U.S. military, diplomatic, economic commitments to East Asia is the effect of the Korean War. One other thing in terms of this broadened U.S. support, its interest in this period, we also have the creation of Israel. So in 1947, the UN General Assembly agrees to a partition of what had been the British Palestinian mandate. The British said they want out of this region, and the partition gives the orange areas to the Zionists as a proposed Jewish state, with Tel Aviv as the most significant city. The purple areas to the Arabs as as a Palestinian state, and then Jerusalem will be under international control under the protection of the UN, and will belong to neither of these states. The Zionists reluctantly accept this proposal. The Palestinians, under strong pressure from other Arab countries, decline it, and the result is the beginning of a civil conflict between Jews and Arabs in the former mandate, that begins in late 47 and in sort of minor intensity, and then really picks up in 1948 when the British announced that they're going to withdraw completely from the country. When they do so, the Zionists proclaim a newly independent country of Israel, and immediately Israel is invaded by all of its neighbors, by Egypt, by Jordan, by Saudi Arabia, by Syria, by Iraq, and so there is this widespread war against the new state, and the Arab armies begin relatively effectively. They push the Zionist forces back. You can see that the Zionist forces control Jerusalem and basically the road between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, also up the coast to Haifa. But most of the country initially is under the control of these Arab armies. But the Zionist armies press back, and eventually, once the conflict ends, there is a new armistice line called the Green Line, which separates Arab from Jewish territory. So the new Israel is sort of right here in the yellow. The West Bank is occupied by the Jordanians, and the Gaza Strip is occupied by the Egyptians. The U.S. extends diplomatic recognition to Israel. It's the first country to do so. The Soviets will be the second country. So Israel is an example of where the Cold War really doesn't apply early in this period. But the U.S. does nothing else. It does not extend military assistance to the Israelis. It's not until the 1960s that the U.S. relationship with Israel will be a close one in terms of economic and military aid. And that's it for our second snippet.